Welcome to tonight's journey. If you're listening to this story as the city has grown quiet, as the lights outside your window soften, and the noise of the daytime world slowly recedes from your thoughts, allow yourself to slow down. Just a little. This video was not created to frighten you. It is not meant to tell tales of the supernatural, nor to provoke panic or extreme imagination. We are here to talk about something deeply human, a moment that millions of people around the world have experienced. Yet very few truly understand. Sleep paralysis, that moment when you are conscious, but your body does not respond. When a familiar room suddenly feels unfamiliar, and when the sensation that someone is present appears, even though you know you are alone. Over the next moments, we will move slowly. We will listen to what the body and the brain are trying to tell us. We will look at this phenomenon through science, history, and humanity's shared memory, without distortion, without exaggeration, without mystifying it. If you have experienced sleep paralysis, consider this a safe place to understand it again. And if you never have, listen, not to be afraid, but to understand why that fear exists at all. That night began like any other. No warning signs, no strange dreams, no unusual sounds, only the familiar rhythm of your own breathing. You are lying in bed, in a room you have slept in countless times before. The ceiling is still there. The walls are still there. Dim light from the hallway or from a crack in the window falls exactly where it always does. And then you wake up, not the kind of waking where you sit up and think clearly. It's morning, but a different state, suspended. Your awareness opens its eyes before the rest of your body can follow. You realize you are lying in bed. You realize time is still moving. You realize you are no longer dreaming. But something is wrong. You try to move your hand, you can't. You try to turn your head, you can't. You try to call out, or even just clear your throat. No sound comes out. Your body is there, intact, but no longer under your control. The moment itself is usually brief, but for the human brain, it lasts long enough for a dangerous thought to appear. I'm trapped. And then another sensation follows, slower, but far heavier. You no longer feel alone in the room. Not that you see someone immediately. At first, it's only a vague feeling, a presence, as if the air in the room has somehow become denser. Something is here, not a sound, not a light, but something deeply ancient in human experience. The sense that someone else is very close. Your heart begins to beat faster. You don't know why you're afraid. The fear arrives before the reason. In a corner of the room, or beside the bed, or just beyond your field of vision, there is someone. People describe it differently. Some say it is a shadow, no clear shape, just a darkness thicker than the night around it. Some say it is a standing figure, no face, no details, but unmistakably human. Others see nothing at all, yet know it is there. The way you know someone is standing behind you before you turn around. What's strange is that the room itself has not changed. The space looks exactly as it did before. The bed is still there. The furniture is still there. The clock on the wall, if you can see it, still ticks forward, second by second. No gates of hell open, No strange light appears. No other world overlays this one. Only one new thing emerges, fear without a clear source. You want to run. You want to sit up. You want to do anything to escape this moment. But you can't. And that helplessness makes your brain do what it always does when faced with danger it cannot name. It looks for a cause. If there is fear, there must be something causing it. And so the man by the bed is created, not of flesh and bone, not by the will of some external force, but by the human brain connecting scattered signals in a very specific state, a state where consciousness is awake, but the body is still asleep. In that moment, the world does not disappear, but the way you perceive it changes. The boundary between what you see and what you feel begins to overlap. Like two images no longer aligned, your eyes are open. The room is still there, but the signals entering your brain are no longer arranged in their usual order. Your brain begins to receive fragmented information. Your body cannot move, not because you are weak, not because you are unconscious, but because familiar commands, move, turn, sit up, are sent and vanish midway, as if an invisible door has closed somewhere in your nervous system. Your breathing feels strange. Not that you've stopped breathing, but you feel you've lost control of it. Your chest still rises and falls, yet each inhale feels shorter than expected. Each exhale leaves behind a small gap, just enough for the brain to ask, "Is this enough?" Your heart rate increases. You don't need to hear it. You feel it, a sharper beat than usual, pulsing in your chest, your neck, sometimes your ears, like an alarm drum pounding directly into awareness. And at the same time, something very ancient activates. The brain's alarm system turns on. No thinking required, no reasoning, no evidence. Only one condition is enough. Something is wrong and you cannot respond. For the human brain, this is a dangerous situation. Hundreds of thousands of years of evolution have taught it that immobility plus loss of control plus darkness equals potential threat. So the brain doesn't wait. It doesn't ask, "What's happening?" It acts. Fear arrives before thought. And in a desperate attempt to understand what's happening, the brain connects the signals: immobility, chest pressure, rapid heartbeat, internal alarm, into a story with survival logic. If there is an alarm, there must be danger. If there is danger, there must be someone. And so, in a room that has not changed at all, a presence is felt, not because it truly exists, but because the brain needs a cause for a state it cannot control. At this point, fear is no longer a reaction. It becomes the space you are inside. And this is where the man by the bed begins to take shape. The brain does what it knows best. It tells a story, a very short story, a very instinctive one, a very effective one. There is an intruder at an evolutionary level. Humans are wired to react strongly to the presence of a stranger in their private space, especially when they are at their most vulnerable, lying still, in the dark, at night. So the story needs no details, no face, no name. Only one feeling: someone is very close, and you cannot defend yourself. For many people, the fear intensifies with every second. Some feel the shadow move closer to the bed. Some feel something pressing down on their chest. Some feel themselves pinned into the mattress. It isn't always painful, but it is always heavy. Heavy in the most literal sense, as if the weight of the world has been placed on your chest. You try to take a deep breath. Air still enters, but it feels insufficient, as if an invisible hand is holding you back, preventing your lungs from fully expanding. At this point, many people think the same thought. I'm going to die. Not because they have stopped breathing, but because the body is sending conflicting signals and the brain cannot process them in time. And in that panic, the image of the man by the bed becomes clearer. Some feel him lean closer. Some feel him staring. Some feel him touch them, even without any specific sensation on the skin. This is where we need to pause. What you are experiencing is not a dream in the usual sense. You are not asleep, imagining another world. You are awake. You see the real room. You hear real sounds. You perceive real time. And that is why this experience leaves such a deep mark. Many people remember it more vividly than any dream they've ever had. Some remember every detail decades later. Some permanently change how they feel about nighttime after their first experience. And here's the most important thing. You are not alone. Across history, in many different cultures, people have told almost identical stories, even though they never met, never read the same books, never shared the same beliefs. They speak of a figure by the bed, a weight on the chest, an unnameable presence, an absolute helplessness. The only difference is what each culture calls it. In one place, it is a spirit. In another, a demon. Somewhere else, a curse. But the experience itself, the structure of sensation, is nearly identical. And that is why this chapter does not end with an explanation. We haven't talked about science yet. We haven't talked about the brain. We haven't talked about REM, sleep, or physiology. We are simply standing here with you in that dark room. At the moment when a person realizes something deeply unsettling, that consciousness can awaken before the body, that the sense of control we take for granted is fragile, and that our most primal fear does not come from darkness itself, but from being unable to move when the darkness seems to look back. In the next chapter, we will step out of that room, not to deny the experience, but to understand what it truly is, and why the human brain is capable of creating a moment so unforgettable. If you're listening to this at night, slow your breathing just a little. You are awake, you are safe, and this journey has only just begun. If the previous chapter held you inside a dark room where fear appeared before reason, then this chapter does not pull you abruptly into the light. It simply brings a small lamp into that space, just enough for you to begin seeing the structure hidden beneath the experience. Sleep paralysis is not a chaotic phenomenon. On the contrary, it happens precisely when the body and the brain are doing something remarkably delicate, transitioning between states. And because it exists at that boundary, even a small disruption can make the entire experience feel unfamiliar, even though the experience itself is not new at all. We often think of sleep as a single stretch of darkness. We close our eyes, time passes, and we open them again in a different morning. But to the brain, sleep is never that simple. It is a continuous sequence of transitions, like tides, rising, falling, slow, and rhythmic, repeating many times each night. Sleep paralysis, also known as night hag, ghost pressure, or in medical terms. Sleep paralysis is not a vague concept born from superstition. It is a clearly described state in sleep medicine, occurring at a very specific moment, just before you fall asleep, or just as you are waking up. In that moment, your awareness is already awake. You know where you are. You recognize the room, the bed, the familiar darkness, but your body does not catch up. Your arms and legs will not move. Your throat produces no sound. Your muscles feel locked, while your mind remains active. This experience easily leads people to believe that something external is pressing down on them. Not because they lack knowledge, but because absolute helplessness is something the human brain is not accustomed to processing. When you cannot move, cannot call out, cannot resist, the brain instinctively looks for an explanation, and in the dark. That explanation often takes on a frightening form. In many cases, sleep paralysis is accompanied by auditory or visual hallucinations. Some people hear whispers, footsteps, or their name being called. Some see shadowy figures, vague shapes, or feel with certainty that someone is in the room. These hallucinations are not signs of psychosis. They occur because the brain is still operating under dreamlike mechanisms, even though awareness has returned. One point must be emphasized clearly. Sleep paralysis is not life-threatening. It does not stop your breathing. It does not stop your heart. But it can generate intense fear, strong enough to leave lingering psychological echoes, especially for first-time experiences. In most cases, sleep paralysis is not considered a disorder requiring treatment. It is not a sign that your brain is malfunctioning. Your body is not broken in a medical sense. Often, reducing stress, getting adequate sleep, and maintaining a stable circadian rhythm are enough for the episodes to diminish or disappear. However, sleep paralysis can occur alongside certain sleep disorders, most notably narcolepsy, a condition in which the boundary between sleep and wakefulness becomes unusually blurred. In such cases, episodes may be more frequent and more intense, and consultation with a sleep specialist becomes appropriate. Research shows that sleep paralysis often begins in adolescence and appears more frequently in the 20s and 30s, periods when life pressure, academic schedules, work demands, and stress fragment sleep. It is no coincidence that many people report their first episodes during times of imbalance in their lives. To understand why sleep paralysis occurs, we need to look at how sleep actually works. When you sleep, your body does not fully shut down. It cycles through stages. Each cycle lasts about 90 minutes and includes two main phases: non-REM, NREM, sleep, and REM sleep. During NREM sleep, the body gradually relaxes, heart rate slows, and consciousness fades. During REM sleep, the brain becomes highly active. The eyes move rapidly beneath closed eyelids. Dreaming occurs, and most importantly, the body is intentionally immobilized. Hormones and neural signals inhibit movement to prevent you from physically acting out your dreams. Sleep paralysis occurs when this immobilization lasts longer than necessary. While the brain has already awakened, awareness returns first, but the muscle-locking mechanism remains active at the same time. Brain regions responsible for threat detection and fear remain highly sensitive, similar to their state during dreaming. The result is a very specific condition. You are awake, but paralyzed. You know you are present, but your emotions carry the tone of a dream. Symptoms vary widely. Some people experience it only once in their lifetime. Others experience it repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single night. Each episode typically lasts only seconds to minutes, but the subjective experience can feel vastly amplified. Common experiences include inability to move or speak, a heavy pressure on the chest, a subjective sensation of difficulty breathing, sweating and rapid heartbeat, a feeling that death is approaching, lingering anxiety, sadness, or mild fixation afterward. What must be remembered is this: these sensations are not signs of real danger. They are the response of a nervous system activated at the wrong moment. Sleep paralysis, ultimately, is not an external intruder. It is the residue of a dream when awareness has awakened, but the body has not yet followed. And at that fragile boundary, the human brain, seeking meaning, creates images that remain unforgettable. This is where the sensation of someone being there arises, not as a being entering the room, but as a hypothesis constructed to fill the gap between fear and helplessness. This also explains why sleep paralysis most often occurs when you are falling asleep or waking up, moments when the system is transitioning, when sleep is deprived, fragmented, or circadian rhythm disrupted. These boundaries become easier to slip, not because the person is weak, but because the system is no longer operating under ideal conditions. The most important thing to understand is this: sleep paralysis is not evidence of something entering from the outside. It is a moment when your internal systems fall out of sync with themselves. A very brief moment, but long enough for the brain to tell a terrifying story. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at those stories, why they are so strikingly similar among people who have never met, across cultures separated by distance and time. For now, remember just one thing: sleep paralysis is not the presence of something in the room. It is the lingering trace of a dream after you have already awakened. When people recount their experience of sleep paralysis, they often begin with the same sentence, even in places far apart across the world. I knew someone was in the room. Not everyone sees something clearly. Not everyone hears a sound, but almost everyone senses a presence. That sensation arrives before the image, before thought, and often before conscious fear. What's strange is this: when researchers collect thousands of accounts from people who have never met, never read the same materials, and never shared the same culture, they find that these experiences are not as chaotic as we assume. They have structure, very clear structure. In sleep paralysis, the brain does not create infinitely. It follows certain patterns tightly linked to how humans evolved to detect danger. Those patterns are often described as 3 classic hallucinatory structures. Not 3 types of people, but 3 ways the brain interprets the same physiological state. And the man by the bed, the most haunting image, often sits at the center of the first structure. In countless accounts, the experience does not begin with seeing. It begins with the feeling of being watched. A woman in Canada described waking up near dawn. She couldn't move, but what terrified her wasn't the paralysis. It was the feeling that someone was standing in the corner of the room. She didn't see anything clearly. It was more like an invisible pressure, as if the space to the left of her bed had become thicker, she said. I didn't see a face, but I knew it was a person. A student in Vietnam said he felt someone standing right behind the head of the bed. There were no footsteps, no sound, but he was certain that if he could turn his head, something he couldn't do, he would see something that should not have been there. This structure is often called the intruder in paralysis. Your brain recognizes that you are in a vulnerable position. The threat detection system activates, but because there is no clear sensory data, no movement, no sound, the brain chooses a different route. It assumes a presence. At the level of survival, that assumption makes sense. In nature, the feeling that someone is nearby is often a warning sign. Humans evolved to react strongly to it. And when you cannot react with your body, the brain shifts to reacting through imagination. That's why the man by the bed often has no face, no specific details, no identity. He doesn't need one. He only needs to be someone else. For some people, that sense stays still, existing only as a terrifying presence. But for others, the story continues and becomes heavier. A man in Germany described feeling someone enter the room. At first, the figure was far away, then closer to the bed, then sitting down at the edge of it. He didn't see it happen, but he felt the weight. The mattress dipped, not dramatically, but enough to make him panic. Another woman said she felt something pressing on her chest. Not a sharp pain, but a steady, continuous weight that made each inhale difficult. She tried to breathe faster, but the more she breathed, the stronger the sensation of choking became. This is the second structure: pressure, attack. In this structure, the man by the bed is no longer still. He interacts, he moves in, he applies force. The crucial point is this: your body is not truly being crushed by an external object. But the sensation can be completely convincing. During REM sleep, the breathing muscles still work, but the sensory signals from the chest and intercostal muscles can be processed differently. Combined with anxiety and an elevated heart rate, the brain can easily interpret a partial, unfamiliar breathing sensation as something is pressing down. And once again, the brain tells the most familiar story. If there is pressure, there must be something causing it. In some cultures, this image is called a ghost pressing down. In others, it's a creature sitting on the chest. But the core experience is the same: paralysis, breathlessness, and the sense of violation. And the fear in this structure is often far more intense because the threat is no longer distant. It has touched you. Many people in this state believe they are about to die, not because they have truly stopped breathing, but because the brain no longer has enough information to calm itself. And then, for some people, the story turns in a different direction. A young man in Brazil said that during his episode. He didn't feel pressure on his chest. Instead, he felt his body become weightless, as if he were drifting up from the bed. He felt himself hovering near the ceiling, looking down at his own body lying motionless below. The feeling was frightening, strange, and oddly quiet. Another woman said she felt intense vibrations throughout her body, as if electricity were passing through her. Then the space began to spin. She didn't see the man by the bed, but she felt herself falling, not toward the floor, but into a void. This is the third structure: movement and separation hallucinations. In this state, The brain misprocesses signals related to balance and body position. When the body is immobile, but consciousness is awake, the system that normally tells you where you are in space loses its reference points. The result can be powerful sensations: floating, falling, vibrating, or leaving the body. Not everyone experiences all three structures. Some people encounter only one, some experience two, and a rarer few go through all three in a single episode. But despite differences in detail, all of these experiences share the same foundation. The brain is trying to make sense of a state it was not designed to handle very often. What makes the man by the bed the most common image is not that something external is truly there, but that it is the simplest and most effective image the brain can use to explain fear in the dark. Humans are social creatures. Across our evolutionary history, the most dangerous threats were rarely abstract. They often had the shape of another being, a predator, an enemy, an intruder entering private space. So, when the brain needs a fast explanation for threat, it chooses the most familiar form: a figure by the bed, close, silent, nameless. And perhaps the reason this experience feels so haunting is that it occurs in the place humans consider safest, the place where we sleep, where we let go, where we do not expect danger. Sleep paralysis is not only a physiological phenomenon, it is the moment primal fear steps into a modern room. In the next chapter, we will move beyond the individual and look wider. Why sleep paralysis sometimes comes in waves, why it can disappear for years, then suddenly return night after night. But before we continue, remember this: the man by the bed does not appear because you are weak. He appears because the human brain is so good at protecting you that sometimes it creates an enemy when it cannot find another explanation. And that is where fear and imagination meet, in a moment that is brief, but powerful enough that you may never forget it. If sleep paralysis happened only once in a lifetime, it might not leave such a deep mark. Many people go through it and then forget, filing it away in a hazy corner of memory, like a brief nightmare that passes. But for many others, sleep paralysis doesn't come alone. It comes in bursts, in sequences, in stretches of time where it feels as if every night you're being pulled back into the same room, into the same familiar helplessness. People often call these periods a wave of sleep paralysis. One man said that for nearly 10 years, he experienced sleep paralysis only once. Then, suddenly, during a month of intense work pressure, it began happening almost every night. Some nights, twice, some nights, he would barely escape one episode before the next one arrived, before he even had time to fall back asleep. And when that phase passed, the paralysis disappeared, quietly, as if it had never existed. Another student said she only began experiencing sleep paralysis during her final year of university. Before that, her sleep had always been deep and continuous. But when her schedule became chaotic, deadlines piled up, and late nights became routine, sleep paralysis appeared. At first, it was once, then twice a week, then almost every night. She couldn't understand why it had chosen that exact period. That question, why now, is the central question of this chapter. Sleep paralysis is not random. It does not wander through a person's life and strike at arbitrary times. These waves tend to appear when the sleep system is pushed out of its usual balance. Not because you did something wrong, but because your circadian rhythm is being forced to adapt to too many changes at once. Human sleep is built on rhythm, night after night. The brain and body repeat relatively stable cycles. When that rhythm is disrupted, even for a few weeks, the fragile boundary between sleep and wake becomes easier to slip. And sleep paralysis, as we've seen, is born precisely from those boundaries. One of the most common factors behind a wave of sleep paralysis is prolonged sleep deprivation, not just one short night, but many days, many weeks in a row without enough sleep. When the body is sleep deprived, it tends to push REM sleep to appear earlier and more intensely, as a way of compensating. That makes the transitions between REM and wakefulness more abrupt, less stable. In that context, the chance that awareness wakes up before the muscle paralysis mechanism has fully switched off increases significantly. Not because REM is broken, but because it is being forced to run under non-ideal conditions. Stress also plays a major role, but not in a vague, abstract sense, physiologically. Stress keeps the sympathetic nervous system, the body's alarm system, on standby. Heart rate stays higher. The brain stays more vigilant. Sleep becomes lighter and easier to interrupt. You might sleep the same number of hours, but the quality of that sleep isn't what it used to be. In that state, the brain wakes more easily. And if it wakes while REM hasn't fully ended, sleep paralysis appears. Many people notice that their waves of sleep paralysis align with particular phases of life: moving homes, changing jobs, preparing for exams, losing someone, or simply living in an environment that no longer feels safe. Not because these events summon sleep paralysis, but because they shake the stable foundation that sleep depends on. Another factor, less often mentioned, yet extremely common in accounts of sleep paralysis, waves, is circadian disruption. Many people don't even realize it's happening, because the disruption often arrives slowly, quietly, and is treated as a normal part of modern life. Staying up late one night and sleeping in the next day, working shifts, morning one week, nights the next, crossing time zones in a short period of time, or even more simply, sleeping during the day and staying awake at night long enough that the body no longer knows what real time is. In these conditions, the brain has no fixed anchor. The signals that normally help it distinguish time to sleep from time to wake become blurred. The on-off mechanisms of sleep stop operating as a smooth sequence and begin to feel like misaligned switches, turning on and off without the familiar order. Sleep no longer feels like one continuous block. It breaks into fragments, sleeping for a moment, waking for a moment, dreaming not yet complete, already awake, awake not fully, already dreaming. And in those patchwork transitions, sleep paralysis finds space to slip in, because sleep paralysis doesn't need deep sleep. It doesn't appear when everything is running smoothly. It appears when the boundaries are blurred. But there is something even more subtle and even more powerful: fear. Many people say their first episode came out of nowhere, without warning, but from the second episode onward, the experience changes. Not necessarily because the episodes become stronger, but because the mind remembers the fear. They begin going to bed with a thought hovering in the background. What if it happens again tonight? That thought, even if it seems small, is enough to change how the body enters sleep. Instead of letting go, they stay alert. Instead of releasing fully, they hold on to a portion of awareness, as if trying to guard their own sleep. They become afraid to sleep, not because they hate sleep, but because sleep no longer feels completely safe. They fear sleeping on their back, because they've heard that position triggers it. They fear the moment their eyes close, because that's when control disappears. They fear the sensation of drifting off, because it was at that boundary that sleep paralysis appeared before. That fear isn't imaginary. It has real effects on the body. When you go to sleep in a guarded state, the nervous system refuses to fully relax. Heart rate stays higher. Breathing becomes shallower. The brain maintains a certain level of wakefulness, as if standing watch. Sleep becomes lighter and easier to break. You still sleep, but you sleep as if you're standing on the edge of a cliff, where even a small stimulus can wake you. The transitions between deep sleep, REM, and wakefulness become more chaotic. And sleep paralysis, born from disrupted transitions, gains even more opportunities to appear. This is when a loop forms. Sleep paralysis creates fear. Fear makes sleep less stable. Less stable sleep increases the likelihood of sleep paralysis. There is no force behind this loop, no intention, only a biological system reacting with extreme sensitivity to its own anxiety. Some people describe it as if sleep paralysis knows they're afraid and uses that against them. But in reality, it isn't sleep paralysis observing you. Your brain is learning from the earlier episodes and trying to predict danger in order to protect you. And the cruel irony is that this protective effort increases the likelihood of the very thing you fear most. This is also why many waves of sleep paralysis don't end because of one specific action. They don't disappear because you confront them. They often fade when fear softens, when sleep regains its original sense of trust, when you no longer go to bed on guard, when your circadian rhythm stabilizes again, when your body relearns that nighttime is for rest, not vigilance. In many cases, sleep paralysis doesn't need to be defeated. It simply needs to stop being fed. And sometimes the first step is not trying to control sleep more tightly, but learning to allow yourself to sleep without fear. Just that alone, and many waves begin to recede. This isn't merely a psychological loop. It is a physiological cognitive loop. The body becomes anxious. The brain becomes vigilant. Sleep fragments. Sleep paralysis occurs. Fear intensifies, and the cycle continues. Some people describe it as if sleep paralysis has learned them, like it knows when they're at their weakest. But in truth, it isn't sleep paralysis tracking you. It's your brain responding with sharp sensitivity to changes inside your own body. During a wave, episodes often don't look exactly the same. One night it may be only a few seconds of paralysis. Another night, an intense sense of presence. Another night, crushing chest pressure. This reflects different levels of activation across brain systems, emotion, movement, balance, depending on how exhausted or anxious you are on a given day. One important thing to note, a wave of sleep paralysis does not last forever. While you're inside it, it can feel as if it will never end. But as sleep gradually stabilizes, as stress lowers, As the body finds its familiar rhythm again, sleep paralysis retreats, often quietly, without announcement. Many people only realize a wave has passed when they suddenly think, "I haven't had it in weeks." No ritual, no victory moment, just the return of peaceful nights. This also helps explain why sleep paralysis tends to appear more frequently at certain ages. Adolescence, when circadian rhythms shift dramatically. The 20s and 30s, when life is unstable, periods when sleep must constantly adapt to new pressures. Sleep paralysis is not a condition that progresses in a straight line. It comes and goes with the rhythm of life. When life tilts, sleep tilts. And when sleep tilts, those fragile boundaries are exposed. One thing must be said clearly. Experiencing sleep paralysis in waves does not mean you are becoming weaker. It is not a sign that your brain is deteriorating. If anything, it shows that your brain is trying to function under overload, and sometimes the glitch happens at the most delicate transition points. In the next chapter, we will step away from physiology and look in another direction. How cultures, over centuries, tried to explain these waves before people had concepts like REM, hormones, or circadian rhythms. What stories did they tell to make sense of a frightening phenomenon arriving in bursts? But before we move on, pause here for a moment. If you're in a wave of sleep paralysis right now, remember, it is not a sentence, it is not permanent. It is a sign that your body needs real rest, not just sleep, but a return to its own rhythm. And like every wave, when the conditions change, it will recede. Before humans had concepts like REM hormones or circadian rhythms, they still had sleep paralysis. Before there were sleep labs, EEG machines, or the term sleep paralysis, people still woke in the dark, immobile, terrified, and asked the same ancient question: what was just in my room? When science could not answer, culture stepped into that space, not as a mistake, but as a human survival mechanism. Human beings cannot endure experiences without names. A vague feeling may confuse us, but a feeling we cannot name is what truly frightens us. Without language to describe it, the brain does not know where to place the experience inside the familiar world. And when it cannot be placed, it becomes a hovering threat, without borders, without limits. So from very early on, humans learned to name fear. Naming is not only for describing, it is for controlling. When a phenomenon has a name, it has a place. When it has a place, it has rules. And when it has rules, it is no longer completely chaotic. A sound in the night with no name is pure panic. But if it is called a spirit, a demon, or a ghost, it instantly enters a system people already recognize, one that tells them how to fear, how to avoid, and how to tell one another about it. Sleep paralysis, because it feels utterly real yet has no visible source, presses directly on this weakness of the human mind. You are immobile, you are awake, you are afraid, but you do not know why. And in the dark, when the senses offer no clear data, the brain cannot accept the answer. There's nothing. It needs a cause. And when science could not provide that cause, culture did what it has always done best. It told a story. Those stories were not created from pure imagination. They were distilled from repeated experience across generations. One person told another that their chest was pressed down. Someone else said they saw a figure by the bed. Another said they could not breathe and thought they were about to die. Over time, the overlapping details were kept. The isolated details were discarded, and a shared figure began to form. That is how the one by the bed was born. Not as a specific individual, but as a template vague enough to fit many different experiences, yet clear enough to trigger fear. What is striking is this: even though the names differ, ghost, demon, spirit, witch, jinn, the core story is strangely similar. Everywhere there is paralysis. Everywhere there is pressure. Everywhere there is a sensed presence. And everywhere there is the primal fear. I no longer control my own body. This similarity is not accidental. It reflects something deeper. The human brain, everywhere, runs on the same principles. When it enters the same physiological state, awareness awake, body locked, fear rising, the brain in any culture will search for an explanation along similar paths. The difference lies in the language used to express that explanation. Where people believe in spirits, the experience becomes interference from an unseen world. Where people believe in demons, it takes the form of evil. Where people believe in ancestors, it becomes a message from the dead. But beneath all those layers of interpretation, the underlying experience remains unchanged. Culture, in that sense, is not the source of the one by the bed. Culture is a mirror reflecting a shared human fear, different images in different places, but the same darkness. And because of that, when we look back at these stories today, we should not rush to dismiss them as mere superstition. They are proof that before science existed, people were still trying to understand and live with what they experienced using the best tools they had: memory, language, and community. The one by the bed is not only a frightening figure, it is the trace of centuries of human beings waking in the night, immobile, panicked, and whispering to one another. I saw it too. It is that repetition across time, across distance, across cultures that makes this story feel so haunting, not because it speaks of the supernatural, but because it speaks of something profoundly human, something so powerful that it forced people to retell it again and again, until it finally had a name. In Japan, this phenomenon is called kanashibari. The word means bound tight with metal, evoking the sensation of a stiff body that cannot move in Japanese folklore. Kanashibari is not always tied to a specific demon. It is often understood as a state of being held, restrained by an invisible force. Traditional Japanese accounts tend not to focus on the attacker's appearance. What they emphasize is the paralysis and the feeling of being suppressed. One Japanese man said that, in his first Kanashibari episode, he saw nothing. But he knew there was a presence right behind his back. He did not think of a devil. He believed he had touched something he should not have touched. Here, culture does not necessarily create a detailed image. It creates a way to interpret the event, an invisible world intervening when a boundary has been crossed. In medieval Europe, the figure often had a clearer face. People called it the old hag, an aged witch. In folk records from Scandinavia, England, and Ireland, the old hag is described as a being that sits on the sleeper's chest, making them unable to breathe, unable to cry out, haunted by the sense that death is near. The phrase hag-ridden ridden by a hag, even entered language as a way to describe exhaustion and misery. A woman in Newfoundland, Canada, said she grew up hearing stories of the old hag. When she experienced sleep paralysis for the first time as a teenager, she did not doubt it. She was certain the hag had come, not because she lacked reason, but because she already had a cultural frame ready to receive the experience. Fear, in that frame, had a shape, and once it has a shape, it feels more real. In other parts of Europe, especially in Germany and the Nordic countries, the one by the bed could be understood as a pressing spirit, an entity not entirely evil, but not friendly either. People believed it appeared when someone slept in the wrong position, or when the home space was disturbed. Familiar folk advice followed. Don't sleep on your back. Don't place a mirror facing the bed. Don't sleep with a mind in chaos. From a modern perspective, these suggestions are not entirely baseless, yet they were wrapped in the language of superstition and symbol. In Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, the phenomenon is called more directly Maje, a pressing spirit. The name is not neutral. It states from the beginning that there is an entity causing the experience. It doesn't require detailed description. Saying the name alone is enough to summon the familiar image. Darkness, pressure, breath caught, voice trapped. Many Vietnamese people say they were taught from childhood that if Maje happens, you must not panic, must not fight, must try to move a finger or recite a phrase. What's interesting is that even though these tips come from folk belief, they partly overlap with what science recommends for responding to sleep paralysis. In this case, culture accidentally touched a physiological truth, even if the explanation was entirely different. In the Middle East and North Africa, the one by the bed often takes the form of jinn, invisible beings believed to live alongside humans. In many stories, jinn appear at night, press on the sleeper's chest, whisper, or torment. In this context, people who experience sleep paralysis often do not doubt themselves. They believe they have encountered an entity already recognized within their community's belief system. In parts of Africa, some cultures describe a similar phenomenon as an attack by witches or by dissatisfied ancestral spirits. Here, sleep paralysis is not only personal, it can carry social meaning, a warning, a sign that something is out of balance between the individual and the community. So what connects all these stories? Not the details, not the appearance, but the structure of the experience. Paralysis, a sensed presence, pressure, fear. Culture does not create sleep paralysis. Culture gives it a name. When an experience has no name, it produces confusion. When it has a name, it becomes familiar, even if it remains frightening. Naming is how humans domesticate fear, turning the unknown into something that can exist inside an ordered world. But naming also shapes the experience. People raised on stories of the old hag are more likely to see a witch. People raised with Maje may sense a nameless entity very close. People familiar with jinn may hear whispers. The brain does not invent from nothing. It uses raw material from the cultural memory you have absorbed since childhood. That does not make the experience less real. It simply shows that fear always travels with story. Today, in a modern world where science has named this phenomenon sleep paralysis, something interesting is happening. Many young people experience it but no longer call it ghosts or demons. They call it the brain lagging, REM getting stuck, a sleep glitch, and with that change in name, the imagery changes too. Instead of seeing a creature, they feel an invisible pressure. Instead of whispers, they hear a ringing hum in the ear. The experience remains, but the story becomes different. This doesn't mean science has erased fear. It has only changed how we live with it. The one by the bed does not disappear when you understand it. But when you know where it comes from, it loses its absolute power. In the next chapter, we will return to the body, to the sensation that terrifies people most, chest pressure, breathlessness, and the conviction that death is near. Why does that sensation feel so convincing? And why does it appear beside the one by the bed in so many stories? Across cultures? But before leaving this chapter, remember something important. Human beings do not fear only because they feel. They fear because they interpret what they feel in the way culture has taught them, and in the darkness of the bedroom, between waking and dreaming. Ancient stories still whisper, not to deceive us, but to help us name our fear. Of everything people describe about sleep paralysis, nothing triggers panic as powerfully as the sensation of pressure on the chest. Not because it is always painful, not because it lasts too long, but because it strikes one of the most primal fears a human being can feel. The fear of not being able to breathe. What makes this experience terrifying is that it doesn't feel like imagination. It isn't vague. It isn't fleeting. It is present, directly inside your body, so strong that in that moment, reasoning becomes meaningless. So what is actually happening? To understand this, we have to return to a simple but crucial fact. Breathing is not entirely a conscious action, most of the time. You don't have to think about it. The brain automatically regulates your breathing based on oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and on the state of the body. You only become aware of your breathing when it is disrupted, or when you begin to worry about it. During REM sleep, that system still works. You do not stop breathing. The body does not switch off respiration. But the way the brain senses breathing during REM can be very different from the way it senses it when you are fully awake. The accessory breathing muscles, especially the intercostal muscles and certain muscles around the neck, may be less active. Breathing is often shallower. This is completely normal during sleep. The problem begins when consciousness wakes up inside that state. When you wake during sleep paralysis, the brain receives one set of signals. I'm awake, I'm here, I'm in the present. But signals from the body say something else. The body is still in sleep mode. That mismatch creates a dangerous gap in perception. You begin paying attention to your breathing, something you would not normally do in ordinary sleep. And once you pay attention, you notice it doesn't feel like daytime breathing. It is shallower, slower, less full. In an alarm state, the brain does not interpret that as a normal variation of sleep. It interprets it in a simpler, survival-driven way. Something is interfering with breathing. At that point, the feeling of pressure on the chest begins to form. Not because there is truly a heavy object there, but because the brain is trying to assign a cause to an unfamiliar sensation. And just like in the earlier chapters, when the brain has no clear data, it tells a story. That story is often very short. Something is putting weight on my chest. This is amplified by another factor, immobility. When you cannot move, you also cannot adjust your posture to find your breath again. You cannot take a deep breath the way you normally would when anxious. You cannot push yourself up. You cannot shift your body. You cannot reflexively respond. So the body sends even more stress signals. Heart rate rises. The sympathetic nervous system, the danger response system, switches on more intensely. And the more you panic, the more breathless you feel. A loop forms very quickly, so quickly you may not even realize when you stepped into it. Your breathing begins to feel shallower, not because the air is lacking, but because it feels insufficient. Each inhale feels as if it only reaches halfway into the chest. There may be no sharp pain, only a difficult emptiness, uncomfortable enough for the brain to lock onto it. And once the brain locks onto the breath, worry appears. Not rational worry, not a clear thought, but a primitive signal in the nervous system. Something is wrong. Immediately, the body tightens. Muscles that were relaxed during sleep become more rigid. Heartbeat accelerates. Blood surges faster. The oldest alarm system humans have is activated without needing a reason, without needing evidence. And that very tension increases the feeling of suffocation. The more you focus on your breath, the more uncomfortable it becomes. You try to inhale deeper, but you can't. You want to change position, but your body won't obey. Each failed attempt becomes another piece of evidence for the brain. I'm losing control. At this point, fear is no longer an emotion. It becomes the space you are inside. There is no room to think, no distance to analyze, only one sensation spreading through awareness. Danger is very near. In that state, the brain is no longer calm enough to say, "This is REM sleep. This is a physiological phenomenon. Just wait and it will pass." The brain doesn't do science when you are in panic. It does survival. It doesn't whisper. It screams. Not in words, but in sensation. Danger. And because the human brain is wired to find causes for danger, it cannot accept nothing. It needs an agent, a threat, something outside you that is creating these feelings. In that moment, fear reaches a level many people describe as pure terror. No thoughts, no language, only the feeling. I'm going to die. Not because you are dying, but because your brain believes you are right at the edge. And when fear reaches that edge, every image, every story, every figure by the bed becomes a consequence. Because before you see anything, before you name any entity, your brain has already made one decision. I am in real danger. And that decision, not the shadow in the room, is what makes sleep paralysis one of the most frightening experiences a human being can have while still awake. And because the human brain evolved to link danger to an external agent, chest pressure rarely exists alone. It comes with an image, or at least a sensation, of something causing that pressure. That is why, in so many cultures, the figure by the bed doesn't merely stand there. It sits on the chest. It presses down. It pins you in place. That image is not chosen at random. It matches perfectly with the physiological sensation the person is experiencing. One man said that during an episode. He felt as if someone was kneeling on his chest. He couldn't see clearly, but he knew it was a heavy being. What convinced him wasn't the image. It was the pressure spreading across his rib cage. Another woman said it felt as if an invisible hand had been placed on her chest, pressing down little by little. She didn't think of demons or ghosts. She thought only one thing: I can't breathe. And that thought made the fear multiply. What matters is this: even though the sensation is powerful, your actual breathing is still occurring. There is no evidence that sleep paralysis causes breathing to stop. But in that moment, subjective experience overwhelms every physiological fact. The brain doesn't react to numbers, it reacts to sensation. And the sensation of not being able to breathe is one of the strongest danger signals the brain has ever learned. Another factor that makes this feel so real is silence. During sleep paralysis, many people cannot hear their own breathing. Normally, when you are anxious, you can hear or feel your breath more clearly, but in immobility, with attention consumed by fear, that internal sound can seem to disappear. The silence becomes yet another proof to the brain. Something is wrong. And then, as a final reflex, the brain throws out its most frightening thought: I'm going to die. This is not a logical thought. It is a survival reflex. When the brain cannot identify the cause, cannot control the body, and cannot soothe itself with familiar data, it chooses the worst-case scenario, not to torment you, but to activate every resource it can. The cruel irony is that the reflex makes the experience even more horrifying. Fortunately, this state does not last, while time may feel stretched inside it. Physiologically, the REM muscle paralysis mechanism will switch off. The body will respond again. A finger moves, a sudden deep breath, a small jolt, and control returns. But the memory remains. Chest pressure is not haunting because it lasts long. It is haunting because it hits existential fear. And that is why many people, after sleep paralysis, fear the figure by the bed less than they fear the moment their chest becomes heavy. In the next chapter, we will move from sensation to action. When sleep paralysis happens, what actually helps you break out? What is just rumor? And how do you face the experience without feeding the fear? But before we continue, remember this: chest pressure during sleep paralysis is not a sign you are dying. It is a sign that your brain is doing what it was programmed to do: react intensely when control is lost. And understanding that is the first step toward keeping fear from taking over the entire room at night. After experiencing sleep paralysis, many people don't ask, "What just happened?" They ask a different question, one that feels far more urgent. What do I do next time to get out? That question doesn't come from curiosity. It comes from the vivid memory of fear, from the moment you are awake, immobile, and convinced you are right at the edge of danger. This chapter is not here to offer a miracle trick. There is no secret ritual. There is no action that guarantees sleep paralysis will never return. But there are things that genuinely help you move through an episode, and more importantly, help you avoid feeding the fear that becomes the strongest fuel for this phenomenon. To do that, you have to understand one core truth. Sleep paralysis is not something you need to defeat. It is something you need to pass through. In the moment sleep paralysis happens, you are in a very specific state. Your awareness is awake, but the motor system is still locked by the REM sleep mechanism. That means you cannot escape through big movements. You cannot sit up. You cannot thrash. You cannot scream. Trying to do those things only gives the brain more evidence that you are losing control, and fear rises. What science recommends, very simple in principle, but not easy in practice, is this. Don't fight with force. Instead, look for small exits. In sleep paralysis, the first thing to understand is that your body is not shut off. It is operating in a particular mode. Large muscle groups, arms, shoulders, back, thighs, are strongly inhibited to prevent you from acting out dreams. But that inhibition is not perfectly uniform. It doesn't lock everything at once, and it doesn't release everything all at once. Smaller muscle groups, especially those not directly tied to powerful movement, often escape that lock sooner. That is why many people don't spring up the instant they recover. Instead, they first notice something tiny, a twitch in a fingertip, a dry swallow, a sudden blink. This is not folk superstition. It is a physiological feature of REM atonia. During REM, the brain prioritizes shutting down motor pathways that could produce large, potentially dangerous movements. But the neural pathways controlling subtler actions, like the tongue, eyelids, and swallowing muscles, are often less inhibited. Because they are linked to basic survival functions and fundamental communication, that is why. When you try to move your entire arm or body, the brain registers a large effort with no response. It can easily be interpreted as, "I'm completely trapped." Fear increases. The alarm system intensifies, and the lock state can feel as if it is extending. But when you make the target smaller, the brain has a much better chance of success. Instead of thinking, "I have to get out right now," shift to, "I just need to find one small point I can reach." Bring all your attention to a single finger, not to move it instantly, but to feel that it exists. The sensation of skin against air, the presence of the nail, its position in space. That focus helps the brain move from panic mode into coordination mode. When you try to generate a very small impulse, like the intention to curl it, don't expect an obvious movement. Sometimes the first change is only faint, like a weak signal. But for the brain, that signal can be enough to begin reopening the pathways of control. One successful tiny movement can pull other movements behind it, like a radio catching a frequency after static. The motor system reconnects to awareness, and the lock begins to dissolve. For some people, the tongue is the most effective exit, trying to press the tongue lightly to the roof of the mouth, or trying to swallow. Uses neural pathways that involve the brainstem, where REM inhibition is often less intense. One successful swallow can trigger a very distinct sense of coming back. The eyelids are another option. Even if you can't open your eyes fully, trying to blink, or even imagining the act of blinking, can sometimes be enough to crack the immobility. The most important thing in all of this is, do not rush. In sleep paralysis, subjective time stretches. A few seconds can feel like a full minute, each time you try and it doesn't work. The brain is tempted to read it as a danger sign. But in reality, it simply means your body hasn't caught up to your awareness yet. REM paralysis does not switch off on command. It switches off on a biological rhythm. And that rhythm cannot be forced faster by panic. So every attempt that doesn't work isn't a failure. It's part of the transition. If you can keep fear from escalating, you're helping the body do what it is already going to do: unlock. Many people say the moment they escape didn't come when they fought, but when they stopped pushing, when they accepted that it might take a few more seconds, when they stopped treating immobility as an immediate threat. In that moment, you don't need strength, you need patience. And patience in sleep paralysis is not waiting in fear. It is allowing the body to complete a cycle it is already in the middle of. When you understand this, each episode, if it happens again, stops being a confrontation. It becomes a transition, with certainty, will end. Alongside small movements, breathing is the second key element. In sleep paralysis, the feeling of not being able to breathe is often intensely subjective. You are not actually stopping breathing, but your brain feels as if you are not getting enough. Instead of trying to inhale deeply, which often fails because the body is still locked, shift to breathing slowly and evenly. As much as you can. It doesn't have to be deep, it just has to be slow. Think about lengthening the exhale, even slightly. A longer exhale sends a countersignal to the nervous system. No alarm needed. That can soften the anxiety, tension, breathlessness loop we described in earlier chapters. One crucial point, often overlooked, is how you talk to yourself during an episode. In that moment, your brain is searching for meaning. If the only meaning it finds is danger, the experience escalates. But if you can place one short familiar phrase into your mind, something you have practiced beforehand, such as, "This is sleep paralysis. It will pass. My body is still asleep," then you are giving the brain an alternative explanation. Not to convince it perfectly, but to reduce panic. You don't have to fully believe the phrase in that moment. You only need it to exist in your mind as a reference point. For the brain, the presence of a familiar anchor can be enough to slow the alarm response. After you break out of an episode, many people immediately sit up, turn on a light, scan the room. That is a natural reflex. But if you want to reduce the chance of another episode happening right away, science suggests giving your body a buffer. Sit up slowly, breathe evenly, register that you have returned to control. If you try to fall back asleep while still panicked, the risk of a repeat episode is higher because your brain is still in vigilance mode. Over the long term, the way you deal with sleep paralysis isn't only about what you do in the few seconds of an episode, it's about the relationship you build with sleep itself. Sleep is not something to control tightly. It needs to be trusted. That may sound abstract, but it becomes very concrete in practice. Keep your sleep and wake times relatively stable. Avoid staying up extremely late and then sleeping in unpredictably. Reduce strong stimulation before bed, not only light and devices, but also thoughts that keep you on guard. If you've experienced sleep paralysis many times, try not to go to bed with fear of sleep paralysis. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to not think about it. It means changing the story you tell about it. Not, "What if it happens again tonight?" but, "If it happens, I know what's going on." The difference between those sentences is small in wording, but enormous in physiological impact. In some cases, especially if sleep paralysis happens frequently, lasts longer, or comes with excessive daytime sleepiness, seeing a sleep specialist is important. Not because sleep paralysis is dangerous, but because it can be one piece of a larger sleep picture. The most important message science emphasizes is this: Sleep paralysis does not need to be fought. It needs to be understood, recognized, and passed through with as little panic as possible. When you stop treating sleep paralysis as a mysterious threat, when you stop believing every episode is a sign of real danger, your brain gradually stops triggering such an intense alarm response in those moments. And when the alarm softens, the fear loop breaks. In the final chapter, we will step back and look at the wider meaning, not only what sleep paralysis is or how to escape it, but what it reveals about human beings. Why does a physiological phenomenon bind so tightly to fear? And why? Even after we understand it. Do humans keep telling stories about the one standing by the bed? But before we move into that last chapter, keep one thing with you. You are not powerless in sleep paralysis. You are simply in a state where your body needs a little more time to catch up with your awareness. And that time always comes. Sleep paralysis, in the end, is not a story about sleep. It is a story about boundaries. The boundary between sleeping and waking, between control and helplessness, between safety and danger, between what humans believe they possess and the moment they realize they do not always do so. The one standing by the bed, the haunting figure that runs through the earlier chapters, is not a mysterious creature waiting to be discovered. It is the crystallization of a deeply human experience, where primal fear is triggered in the most modern of settings: a familiar room, a safe bed, an ordinary night. We often think fear comes from darkness, from what we cannot see clearly. But sleep paralysis reveals something more profound. The strongest fear does not come from darkness, but from helplessness in familiar, dim light. You can see your room, you know you are home, and precisely because of that, when your body does not obey, when your breathing feels unfamiliar, fear has nowhere to hide. Humans evolved to control their own bodies. The ability to move at will is the foundation of safety. When that foundation is suddenly removed, even for a few dozen seconds, the brain has no choice but to activate every alarm system it has. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. In that state, the brain does not ask, "Does this make sense?" It asks, "Am I in danger?" And when it cannot find a clear answer, it creates a story. That story always has a character, an intruder, a presence, a someone. Not because humans need demons, but because the brain needs causes. Causes give fear a shape. And once fear has a shape, it becomes easier to face than a nameless sensation flooding awareness. That is why, throughout history, across different cultures, people have seen different figures by the bed, yet experience the same structure of fear. Culture does not create sleep paralysis. Culture allows people to tell it, to share it, and to live with it. Today, as science has named this phenomenon sleep paralysis, as we understand REM sleep, muscle atonia, and circadian rhythms, something interesting happens. The one standing by the bed does not disappear completely, but it changes form. Instead of a distinct being, many people now feel an invisible pressure. Instead of whispers, they hear a low hum. Instead of fearing demons, They fear the loss of control itself. This shows us something important. Science does not erase primal fear. It only changes the language fear uses. And perhaps that is the most important lesson sleep paralysis teaches us about being human. We do not fear because we do not understand. We fear because there are moments when understanding arrives too slowly to calm sensation. In sleep paralysis, reason always comes second. Sensation comes first. And the strongest sensation is helplessness, the inability to move, to call out, to escape. Yet within that moment, another truth quietly reveals itself. The body always finds its way back. No matter how intense the fear, the REM paralysis will switch off. A finger will move, a deep breath will come, and control will return. Sleep paralysis is not a prolonged attack. It is a temporary disruption in transition. What makes it haunting is not its danger, but the way it brings you face to face with an ancient fear, the fear of being trapped inside your own body. Seen this way, the one standing by the bed is no longer an enemy. It is a sign that your brain is reacting powerfully to protect you, even if that reaction is sometimes excessive. Understanding this does not make the experience pleasant, but it changes how you exist within it. Instead of resisting in panic, you can recognize it. Instead of believing you are in real danger, you can hold on to a small awareness. This is a state. It will pass. And when fear is no longer fed, the loop begins to weaken. You may never completely forget what a sleep paralysis episode feels like, but that memory does not need to hold absolute power. It can become a reminder that humans are not strong because they always maintain control, but because they know how to return to control when it is briefly lost. If you are listening to this story at night, perhaps you have experienced sleep paralysis yourself, or perhaps you are simply curious about a strange phenomenon. Either way, remember that you are not alone. Millions of people across different eras have awakened in the same state, feared in the same way, and then returned to their ordinary lives. The one standing by the bed is not a sign that something is wrong with you. He is a reminder that you live in a remarkably complex body, with a brain programmed to protect you at all costs. And sometimes, that protection takes the shape of fear. As this journey comes to a close, you do not need to remember terminology. You do not need to recall every mechanism. Just hold on to one simple feeling. You are awake. You are safe. And if sleep paralysis has appeared, or ever appears again, it does not define you. It is only a deeply human moment on the fragile boundary between dreaming and waking. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. You can share your experience, or simply say where you are listening from and what time of night it is for you. Those stories, told, named, shared, are how humans have always faced fear together. And if you are listening in the dark, let your breath slow just a little. The night is still there, but you are no longer alone.